I always felt, I suppose, having studied politics, that if that's what I was going to specialise in, why shouldn't I? It was kind of my subject. And I've been very interested in politics for a long time, ever since, I suppose, when I went to America when I was 18 in my gap year, and I heard Martin Luther King make his I Have a Dream speech. So from then on, I was really very involved in following not just British politics, but American politics. I saw Winston Churchill make one of his last appearances in the House of Commons. So I had quite a good background in terms of, this is an area I think I know a bit about and I want to continue with. So when the time came for me to specialise, politics seemed to be the natural place for me to be. But of course, if you try and do that in the BBC, they usually say no. They like to push you around. They don't really like you to work out where you want to go. So that was quite a fight, but eventually I did get that. The curious thing about the Martin Luther King speech was that I didn't know anything about him at all. I was just in the crowd, a crowd of about 250,000 people who were in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And it was called the March on Washington, and this was the end of a whole series of demonstrations in 1963 that had gone right across the country, and there were race riots and all sorts of things leading up to it. And I had gone back to Washington, having gone through the southern states, and I thought, well, I really would like to go to see that. But the family I was with were, frankly, southern racists. I mean, they really hated the whole thing, so I couldn't tell them that's what I was going to do. They said, "You're going downtown," was the only reference to it. So I went on my own, and there were a whole series of speeches. Some of them were pretty boring, and then about number 14 or 15, this guy stood up, and people forget he was only 34 when he made the speech. So as a young guy, he'd been in prison for most of that summer, but he didn't make any reference to that. And he did suddenly start talking about having a dream. And then, of course, the whole place erupted. There were people who treated it really as if it was some kind of, well, sort of church affair. This was the Baptist preacher, and the congregation were answering back, saying, "Oh, yeah." And the response from the crowd was absolutely enormous. And I thought, this guy's good. And my father was a vicar, so I knew quite a bit about what's it like to try and make a sermon in those conditions, and thought this is difficult. But no, it was an extraordinary moment where you suddenly came across this amazing speech. And it became then, curiously, more famous when he was killed 5 years later. People then went back to that because, of course, he was then the perfect man, and everything he'd done, and his private life was pretty rickety. But all that was forgotten because he'd made the great speech. And it was the great speech because America was having to decide, really, which way to go. Would they follow the Martin Luther King path, which is really just to have a sort of aspiration, so you would remove racial tension, you would remove discrimination, but you wouldn't set off a sort of bitter racial strife. So that's why the speech itself was always such an amazing moment people look back on, because that was the crossroads, and he pointed that way, and America, thank goodness, followed. I think really it was after a long period as a general reporter, covering wars and going all over the place and meeting lots of interesting people, it did seem to be time to sort of just move back a bit, and also to allow for more thoughtful, more original reporting, which you can do at Westminster. Often when you're just doing action stories, it's all a bit boom, 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 and that's it. So I was quite pleased to be able to get into a place where you could be funny as well as serious, where you could tell all sorts of different scenes, and you could explain lots of policy, particularly about areas of the world that you'd been into. So obviously in my case that meant Northern Ireland, it meant Vietnam in terms of the Vietnam War, but the Middle East, Rhodesia, which was then what Zimbabwe was called. But there are all sorts of things that I'd experienced as a reporter. So when people were talking about world events, I knew a good deal about that. And it was fun to see it from the Westminster angle. So a lot of my time at Westminster was spent being absorbed by the story, and also seeing how the government and how ministers would react to these extraordinary problems. I suppose, my first big foreign trip was to Vietnam, and that was pretty extraordinary. I was there when that famous picture of the girl was taken. She was a 9-year-old girl running along the road, and she was naked, and the attack had taken place with napalm, and her brother, who I met years later, had shouted to her, "Take off your clothes," because they were all on fire. And so she just ran down the road, but it was the way the photograph caught this, and they caught the mayhem behind. And I was in a field not very far away, and I saw the planes going in with the napalm bombs going off, and I really had an extraordinary sort of ringside seat to some amazing events, not just in Vietnam, but in other places. But it was such an important place in my life when I was young. All the students were interested in Vietnam. Everyone was interested in what it would be actually like. But to be there, that was very striking. That was quite, for a young man, that was my first job. And I was chef de bureau. I was the BBC's chief man in Southeast Asia, briefly. I was outside the Paris embassy when Margaret Thatcher received news of the leadership ballot, and when we saw the figures we realised that she would have to go into a second round, and the moment we saw that we realised she was in deep trouble. She was fighting Heseltine, as everyone perhaps remembers, and she hadn't scored enough. It was only 2 people. If 2 people hadn't voted for Heseltine but had voted for her, she could have avoided a second ballot. So once we saw that, we thought, this is it. And I was standing outside the embassy, and I thought, well, she probably won't come out. And I checked with one of her staff. I said, she won't be coming out. And he said, no. I said, she'll be consulting with colleagues. So I knew the camera would be right on me, and I would be straight into the 6 o'clock news very, very soon afterwards. And so Peter Sissons, the newsreader, said to me, what's the reaction from Mrs. Thatcher? And I said that was it. And on these occasions you're given an earpiece to work out what's going on, and mine wasn't working very well that evening, so I didn't hear Peter Sissons shout, "She's behind you," and something like 13 million people shouted, "She's behind you," because that was the audience they recorded afterwards. And it was, people then thought like it was a pantomime incident, and that's what it was called for a lot of people, because all these people think, oh no, look behind you. But you've got to be careful about turning around. If you do that on television, there's nothing there, you can be a bit of a twit. But someone jumped up in front of the camera, and I then did turn, and to my delight, genuine delight, charging towards me was Mrs. Thatcher, Birmingham, and the man from Number 10 who said she wasn't going to come out. And as she came across towards me, they shouted, "Where is the microphone?" Now, I didn't know. I genuinely did not know what they were saying, so I offered my own microphone. She saw me. She thought, oh, well, if she talks to me, she'll be talking to a lot of people. So she then gave her statement saying it was her intention to go on and fight on at the second round. And she then turned and swept out. But Ingham and the other man from Number 10 had been pushing and shoving me and saying, where is the microphone, before this incident. So what people saw was a shambolic scene, and they were trying to get her past me to a microphone which had been set up in front of all the other reporters. So it was an amazing misunderstanding and genuine fighting, pushing and shoving and all that sort of thing. And the curious thing is that the people watching it at home thought, my goodness, she's lost her grip on power. But she had, and she resigned 2 days later. So it was a great sort of television exclusive for me, for the BBC, and made me famous. Finished her career off. I mean, Strictly Come Dancing was just a daft thing that happened to me. I didn't think there'd be so much dancing involved, and I certainly had no idea that I'd be taken up by an awful lot of people. Something like 1.6 million people, I was told, voted for me to stay in Strictly Come Dancing, which is the same number of people who voted last year for Scottish independence. And it really was a very bizarre thing, because I was one of the few people who had no idea about dancing. I thought that'd make it more interesting. So I would turn up, but all sorts of other people involved, taking it very, very seriously, and then to train. Some of them had trained for years for all this. I mean, it was a peculiar sort of atmosphere, and I just thought, oh, it'd be fun. And once the public could see that, they then thought that the judges were being unfair. And of course, that's the thing that affects people in Britain more than anything else. If people think that something is being done that's unfair to a person, and particularly if they, for whatever reason, like that person, that's high combustion. So it did rise up a great deal, and there was a danger, I don't know how big a danger, but there was a danger that I might win, because week after week after week, the judges were being daft and criticising me, and people were getting very annoyed. So I did think the only thing to do, particularly as an old loyal BBC hand, was to resign. And of course that got people even more excited. I know, not very long ago, Tony Blair said to me, he said, even I had to watch you. So it was a big thing, and it had a big effect on my career. I suppose led to all sorts of other things, it did.